to the Sunday supplement, and this is Propenomix, and this week it is called Promises. We've had an interesting week with the King's Speech apart from anything else, so I'm going to get right into it. As you'll know if you listen regularly, I like to start with a quote, and this week's is: "Promises the uniquely human way of ordering the future, making it predictable and reliable to the extent that this is humanly possible." And that's from Hannah Arendt, the historian, philosopher, German-American. So before I get started, make sure you save the date for the next property business workshop. It's Tuesday the 1st of October. This time around we're going to be covering exits with two main objectives. Firstly, planning your own, which people do very poorly in my experience. And secondly, so you can understand other people's exit plans, or lack of them usually, and assist with them when looking to buy a portfolio or a business. Help the vendor get what they want, need and deserve, and work towards a true win-win solution. As always, it will be action-packed, content-filled day which will stand alone in helping you to advance your understanding as a property business owner. So welcome to the supplement, everyone. That was a week that was, eh? Someone took a shot at the Donald and Hulk Hogan got involved. Meanwhile, in the real world, oh, wait. We've got a King's Speech to look at in the deep dive and plenty of meaningful macro to get stuck into this week. So I'm going to get on with it. In terms of the real-time market stats I like to discuss every week, obviously Mr. Watkin had a birthday this week, looking at his socials, and it looks like he had the week off. Unacceptable. Only kidding, Chris, if you're listening to this, happy birthday. Back to business as usual next week, I suspect. We'll make do with the extra insight into the slightly less real-time market in the macro section, with the ONS figures for house prices and rents for May and June that have just been released. So alongside that in the macro, it feels pretty crowded this week. Inflation and unemployment both make the cut ahead of retail sales and confidence. They have to, really. I may well come back to confidence next week, but you know that the fourth slot has to be reserved for the bonds and swaps. So, the ONS house report then. House price report, which since February this year has now incorporated rents, and it doesn't just incorporate them, it actually leads with them. You see very little economic news about this actually, just as you do about OOH, the owner-occupier cost of housing inflation, which at 6.8% is currently as high as it has ever been since they started the measure, which is somewhat synthetic. I have explained this before, but this is the massive cost of a remortgage when it comes along. And bear in mind, well over 50% of owned homes have no mortgages. So the 6.8% is more like a 100% increase for 6.8% of the households per month. Rents are up 8.6% in the year to June 2024, down from 8.7% last month. Still, well ahead of inflation and indeed wages, apart from minimum wage and those pegged to minimum. England's average rent is now £1,310. 9.2% was the highest point in this cycle, probably in this cycle anyway, in March 2024. Rents have been slower to adjust than many other prices, but they're definitely adjusting, as you will have noticed. Rents in Northern Ireland are up 10.3% year on year, as prices and rents continue to absolutely surge in the post-Brexit Northern Ireland. House prices on the ONS measure, which is the only really accurate one, by the end of May were up 2.2% in the past 12 months. That's a move from 1.3% in the 12 months to April 2024. There were 8 consecutive months where this was negative before it turned positive for figures as at the end of March 2024. Geography and higher or lower absolute prices is still dominating the change in prices because wages, whilst higher in the south, are not higher enough to cope with these bigger interest rates, so the market is still levelling up in its own time. Very slowly though, I should add, but that's what I used as this week's image. Rent is up 22.5% in the past 4 years in England, almost smack on where inflation has landed, but with more to come in this cycle you would expect. The rent geography turns the price geography on its head, with London leading the charge at 9.7% annual rent inflation, although the Midlands is performing well on both price and rents. Either way though, yields are still increasing, not decreasing. This single factor will bring more investment money to the rental market, although it's a slow process. The ONS now has the average London rent at £2,098. The West Mids average is £876. And the East Mids average is £827, even though the average wage is higher in the East Mids. The East Mids still looks good for me for rent growth in terms of affordability. This is just a mini snapshot into why demographic area analysis can be worthwhile. There's some fabulous interactive tools you can play with on the Office for National Statistics website as well, if you want to. I would highly recommend them. On to inflation then, as there's lots to talk about. The economic consensus changed from before last weekend, where they said it would be a 2% print, to the day before, where the experts updated their forecasts and came out with 1.9% on average. And of course, to laugh in their face, it was 2% as the print. There would have been some psychology in that 1.9% print if it had happened, much as none of the professionals would want to admit it. This is all CPI, of course, which is the target measure for the Bank of England. The ONS prefers CPIH, and you'd have to think that this is more realistic when it comes to pounds in pockets. Because rents and mortgages are going up or have gone up so much, CPIH remains higher at 2.8%. The month by month was 0.2%, and that was the same as it was 12 months ago. The month to month CPI was 0.1%, which again is the same as 12 months ago, but is a nice low print, although it's fairly typical of this time of year. Indeed, the ONS identify the restaurant and hotel sector as the biggest sinner in terms of pricing for this month in question, June, and really just hotels. And so, Swifty got the blame, didn't she, for perhaps 0.1% of the inflation, after she did 3 nights at Wembley and 7 nights in the UK in total. She's got 5 more at Wembley in August, so bear that in mind. There's life goals, and then there's adding 0.1% to CPI. I'm so big, I'm inflationary. I find it mind-blowing. What goes up should come down here, though, after August, so perhaps that's helpful when the other measures will start going upwards again, and we've had the final energy price cap dividend from the downward side of that curve. Core CPIH and core CPI stayed the same as May's numbers, 4.2 and 3.5 respectively. Still far too high. CPIH services ticked back up to 6%. CPI services remained at 5.7. Core progressed only 0.2% in June, which is a welcome low compared to the 5 months leading up to that. Core CPIH was 0.3% month on month. Both of those, though, were identical with June 2023's month-on-month figures, which of course drop out of the figures after 12 months. OOH still hasn't found its high in this cycle, or else June was the high, time will tell. 6.8%, as I mentioned earlier, owner-occupier housing inflation. So look, the moral of the story is the sting in the tail is still progressing just as I detailed over 18 months ago. Those who called inflation under 2% or well under 2%, as one well-known consultancy did when predicting 2024, have been wrong. This is the sludge to shake it off. Sorry, I couldn't resist as Tay-Tay was finally relevant to the supplement. And this is what happens when inflation becomes embedded in a system. This was exactly why the transitory argument was such a bunch of hogwash when it was getting wheeled out left, right and centre by central banks and other economic forecasters. Okay, I'll get back in my box now. Moving on to the labour market report then. There's still at least another 6 months to go before we can start to trust the data a little more. We were promised it would be September. This is more than annoying. The data makes a real difference to the Bank of England's interest rate decisions. In short, COVID drove a truck through some of the data collection methods, and the ONS is still scrambling to fix it. Yuck. The data doesn't feel or look too wrong, though, from the snippets I've seen in terms of real-time surveys, recruitment reports and the likes. Hopefully it's a fuss about nothing. But if there was an error of, say, 0.5%, it would be really, really significant. The ONS take is that cooling is still going on gradually. Vacancies still falling from the pandemic highs, still remaining above pre-pandemic numbers, but only just, with plenty more workers in the job market over that near 5-year period now, especially if you count those who are currently on the economically inactive list. 16,000 more employees went on the payrolls for June, which was better than expected and predicted. The headline rate, unemployment, stayed at 4.4, but actually the economically inactive rate came back down to 22.1, which leaves 74.4, and yes, that doesn't add up to 100, who are employed. I would have been a bit more positive than the ONS were in their roundup, and personally it looks like the trends have been snapped off, and this is at or very close to peak unemployment for this year, shocks aside. Wages, including or excluding bonuses, converged, but came in at 5.7%, however you measured it. With OOH at 6.8 and rents at 8.6, this isn't inflationary, and at this point I'd be ruling out any concerns about wage growth from discussions in the interest rate. There is no wage price spiral here. but this is probably just reason number 357 as to why I'm not on the Bank of England Monetary Policy Committee. Adjusted for CPIH, this puts real wage growth at 2.8% at the moment, but any real benefits are likely being swallowed by housing costs before any of it can be saved or spent in the productive economy. We're down to under 50,000 days of work being lost per month down to labour disputes, and hopefully that will come back down again as the final strikes are now ironed out by our new great leaders, right? The answer there is, I'm sure, it depends on how they fix the problem. We've seen some headlines just this morning about 5.5% pay increases for teachers and doctors. If you put that together with what I've just told you, what that means is slightly below average pay increases apart from anything else. Sorry, teachers and nurses, not teachers and doctors, because that's still yet to be negotiated. Anyway, the overall takeaway here is just as I started to speak of in early 2023. The worst was over, and here comes the come down. The last mile, just like in logistics, is difficult, long, expensive and arduous. My treacle analogy springs to mind. Months and months go by and very little progress is made. I was sure about this because I'd seen it occurring in other developed economies who were ahead of us in the cycle, the US being the main one, although there of course have been some major differences between the two. But the sludge, folks, is simply going to continue for the moment, I'm afraid. Anyway, the gilts and swaps markets. We opened a shade lower for the week at 3.945 as those forecasts came in for inflation to hit 1.9. However, we didn't. We closed the week at 3.936. Still a down week, but not even by 0.01%. Another really boring one, to be honest, which is fine by me. Boring and downwards. Long may it last. We closed Thursday at 3.897, and so the swaps on Thursday closed at 3.809. Not quite getting that whole 0.1% discount, and not quite getting under that 3.8% level. This still sees those limited company 5-year fixes starting at 5.8 before arrangement fees are considered pretty much, although there is room to go lower, particularly for building societies and deposit takers. All rounded up then, and on to the King's speech. The pomp and circumstance is incredible to watch, and there's extra excitement, of course, because of the change of government. Blackrod making her presence felt. The gold carriage probably makes you feel one way or another. It doesn't move a lot in me because I'm solely focused on the content, exciting chap that I am. And there was plenty of it. 39 bills, prioritising some. For example, no room to discuss the promised votes for 16 to 17-year-olds. I suppose this isn't that popular or unpopular, otherwise they'd need to get it out of the way early. I feel there's an assumption here that all youngsters will vote Labour, but in reality, youngsters will vote for change, but at a low participation rate if you just extend that 18 to 24 demographic. Anyway, on to what actually did make the cut and what we'll cover. Don't get too excited, there's only 7 days of sitting in the Commons before the summer break, although the Commons are due to come back on Monday the 2nd of September, so the new government are keen to get on with it. Credit-worthy compared to some of the summer holidays they've had over the years. The conference is also early, presumably because it was pretty much a waste of time this year, backslapping to be done by Labour, crying by the outgoing administration. It will leave a clear path for the fiscal statement, which I await with a fair mixture of dread on a personal level, anticipation, and an element of hope on a macro level. Just remember, as I've been telling myself for the last, I've lost count of how many years, to be honest, don't worry about what you can't control. Anyway, into the bills. The background briefing document is the one I've focused on, ignoring the pomp and circumstance. It's a 104-page document that accompanies the speech, and as always, I will try and stick to the relevant parts for the readers and listeners of Propenomix. I don't promise no tangents though, I never do, but here we go. The overall property media seem to vote for cautious optimism. That phrase rears its head again for different reasons. Earlier this year it's all about the economy, and that's proven to be correct on a macro level. Real wage growth, economic growth above 1%, and a recession to drop out of the year-on-year figures as we get into the second half of 2024 proper. Inflation at 2%, even if the likelihood is we go back above 3% in relatively short order. Rates on mortgages much higher than they were, but well below the base rate for retail buyers or the main market. Now it's about opportunity for developers and investors. Cautiously. There are 6 categories in the document. The first is economic stability and growth, as you'd expect if you followed any of the rhetoric in any way, shape or form over the past 3 months. This is the meat of the bills. Then Great British Energy. Then secure borders, cracking down on antisocial behaviour and taking back our streets. I must say I'm feeling a bit less hopeful on that lot. Then breaking down the barriers to opportunity. A good choice of words. It sounds like they support equality of opportunity rather than equality of outcome, but time will tell. And some in the ranks definitely support the latter, which is meddling on a level as to be harmful. And then health, and then national security. Where are we concentrating? Well, economic stability and growth, of course, and also on the opportunity part, because that's where the Renters Reform Bill, or now renamed as the Renters' Rights Bill, appears. And also the Leasehold Commonhold Reform Bill sits. Remember, that was passed in the wash-up after the last election was announced, but with the detail all still to be fleshed out. Now, planning made it to second place in the PM's introduction to the speech, behind the Budget Responsibility Bill, which we'll look at, because the danger of it being a bit of a post-mortem about why and how Liz the lettuce got it so badly wrong. There are a lot of chips in the pot on planning reform, and my gut feel is that this is the nettle to grasp for sure, but will solve perhaps 40 to 60% of the problems that there are in the sector as we speak. Some of the rest are, in reality, outside of government control, including a risk-free rate of return of 4% at the moment, which makes investment landscapes look very different to when risk-free rates were 1% or lower. Let's get stuck in anyway. The Budgetary Responsibility Bill closes the door on any permanent tax changes without consulting the OBR, which is exactly what Liz tried to do. Is that any good? Well, I guess it depends on the detail, of course. I might just cut taxes for a temporary 20-year period, might I not? The words they use are significant and permanent, so perhaps temporary is limited to the rest of the lifespan of that government. There's one of the world's great accounting scams that goes on, by the way, at local authority and central government levels already, where permanent problems get called temporary. I'll give you the best example: temporary accommodation, where the average client stays 2 years in a house that's often provided by a provider with a 12-month contract, because that sits in a different place on the balance sheet or in the income statements. It's pathetic. It really feels like an I told you so bill, really, but I'm a huge advocate that trusts or anyone should not be able to overrun the checks and balances that have been rightly put in place. The OBR was founded to clear up in the wake of the financial crisis, and the handling or lack of it, now beefing it up in the wake of Truss, seems like the lesser of the evils to me. Truss still maintains that the blob, the deep state and the lizard people stopped her from doing a great thing, and that the markets were wrong. Difficult to imagine a more ironic statement from someone who's such a conservative, and that's exactly why she needed stopping. She was wrong then, she's still wrong now. Her lack of understanding or care about the economic circumstances around her policies are exactly why we needed and do have an independent Bank of England and an Office for Budgetary Responsibility. That doesn't mean either of them are perfect, or indeed much good some of the time. It just means they're better than the shadow dictatorship, which we would have had otherwise if one or two misinformed ideologues can get themselves into 10 or 11 Downing Street without an election. To Reeves et al., it is because either Truss was such, that's a Freudian slip, isn't it? Truss was such a cock-up that they feel this is needed. Or it's a bite of the thumb towards Osborne at the administration that introduced the OBR in the first place. You introduced it to clean up after us. We're beefing it up to clean up after you. I hope that they're above that at the political level, but there is a little feeling of that. The National Wealth Fund is up next, and that's theoretically exciting because it could bring some healthy returns. And you'd think 25% government, 75% private sector, if that's how it works, could bring in some decent funds without using taxpayer money in the now. It's a rock and a hard place. PFI, the Private Finance Initiative, gets a very hard time, including from me. But I have read the argument that it started badly and did get better, which makes sense, and it's nearly always how governments operate. So far, the UK Infrastructure Bank has deployed $3 billion, with $11 billion from the private sector. So, it appears tried and tested, and simply renaming and scaling up something that's already going on, and look, if it works, scale it up, that sounds okay. We probably need 20 times this amount of investment in pretty short order, so hopefully this is another case of simply getting on with it. Pensions reform is next, but is mostly looking at where the sector is either charging too much or not offering the services that the average retiree needs. It sounds good in theory if it delivers cost savings. They're suggesting the average pension pot can grow by 11k by implementing these measures. I hope that's true. And for a long time, it's true that the financial services industry has gouged pensions and charges far too much for providing pretty rubbish service. So I actually support the reforms in this area if this is where we're going with it. There's quite a few bits actually that have a feel of the average sort of Jeremy Hunt fiscal statement about them. A different flavour, granted, but seeing the high level data, seeing the opportunities, asking the right questions, and then to an extent, cooking the books. Great, but will it work? Does it need to? Because if the forecasts are believable, the debt stays at a workable price, and the system keeps working. It's a bit worrying, that level of candour, isn't it? On to planning and infrastructure then. Planning is a brake on economic growth. After a fashion, sure, but we're getting in the weeds of the 0.1% here. Nonetheless, a Dave Brailsford style approach of getting 1% better per day, 0.1% better per month would be fine for GDP, to be honest, should be seen as a positive. A fair amount of me feels that planning does need governmental meddling, but only because that is better than the status quo of local community meddling, not because I inherently approve of government meddling. Nevertheless, no one comes in with a clean slate, so fair enough. We're promised a streamlining and speeding up of the planning process for all tenures. Hurrah! But is a government introducing 39 new bills at the first opportunity one that is going to streamline processes? This sounds like it needs less red tape, not more. So I remain sceptical. Sorry. We're promised modernised planning committees, increased capacity. We've already heard about 300 new planning officers, under half an officer per MP. It can surely only be described as a start compared to what the local authority figures say, but a start is better than no start. Critical infrastructure streamlining won't affect us as investors, but it will affect us all, I'm sure. Prepare for pylons, but pylons are what we need. The rhetoric won't match the outcomes here, though, I don't think, because more net zero is not more energy security necessarily until nuclear is truly embraced. Haven't seen it mentioned thus far, other than at a high level, critical part of our mix from Starmer, which is correct, but what and when, given how long it takes us to deliver a nuclear project? Compulsory purchase compensation rules getting further reform. Sounds like the government will buy cheaper. At one end of the wedge, a further infringement on private property rights, which I'll never be keen on. At the other, I don't know where to get the data on CPOs and how fair they are or ever have been, because all you ever see is anecdotal evidence. I did like the sound of using development to fund nature recovery, or both are stalled, but I doubt this extends much beyond executive detached houses in the green belt. Perhaps I'm being unfair. The facts they cited as key here really are quite bewildering. Timescales for planning decision making are growing. Only 9% of local planning authorities, LPAs, are determining more than 70% of non-major applications within 8 weeks. Only 1% of LPAs determine more than 60% of major applications within the statutory 13-week period. The word statutory, of course, meaning the law. 1%. I mean, I should be all in favour of getting this right in theory. However, no one seems to have asked yet, is the timescale wrong in the first place? It is with constrained resources, clearly. Are the categorisations, major and non-major, enough or sufficient? Would perhaps 4 categories be better? This will all be fleshed out in the Houses of Parliament, of course. There's no denying those figures are pathetic as far as having targets goes. There's clearly local political support needed to get projects through at the moment. How do you change that? Up next, in 2022-23, the National Development Management Service, local planning services effectively, cost £794 million to operate, with an estimated funding shortfall of £262 million per annum. This legislation will increase local planning authorities' capacity to deliver an improved service. That's about 25% underfunded. Probably compares with most local authority departments these days, if not better off, to be honest. The rest is mostly about significant infrastructure and particularly energy. This was an interesting sentence I just wanted to highlight. This is about nationally significant infrastructure projects. Legal challenges have also increased since 2021. 4 successful out of 15 legal challenges, prompting 18 actors to increase the scope and volume of their environmental impact assessments to tens of thousands of pages. So, we get a first flavour here of the tension there will be between this iteration of Labour and the Green lobby. Good, because this conversation needs to happen, and is far better to happen on the centre-left than anywhere else, simply being pragmatic. It will get ugly, fast, though. My fear remains that this is the best but only the top of the funnel solution, and I'm still yet to hear more about the reality of supply-side constraints in the construction industry. And what do you think happens if they do get nationally significant infrastructure projects moving faster to a declining construction workforce? This is where things stop adding up in delivery. Maybe we'll just get more people and construction will go on the list for critical immigration. I don't see any other short-order solutions. Employment rights are next and outside of scope, but one thing I say is this. We'll soon find out whether employees do like 0 hours contracts sometimes, or whether larger companies just say they do. The risk of employing people seems to be going up, which you would think would lead to more contracting and more offshoring. We'll find out, but if they handle this legislation badly or are anti-SME, that will hurt the job market. Devolution next, and this is devolution in England to local authorities. Again, this fits an ideological agenda that I'm unclear on, or have not seen facts and data to back up why this will be good. It could be. The best they've got to say is this: if the autonomy of UK cities was to increase to the same level as Helsinki, productivity would increase across all cities by an average of 12%. And with this, I'm proud to announce the naming of the Lawrence Paradox, which is what I've named the phenomenon that large swathes of the ruling class state that Scandinavia is in some part better than the UK, but none of them ever live there or move there. At this time, while local authority budgets are out of control and local politicians are clearly less competent and the national standard hasn't been great, I'm not convinced this is going to be as good as it sounds. Again, railways coming back into public ownership after 5 years, over 5 years. The rock and the hard place, really. If we return to the days of British Rail, I don't think anyone will look upon that as progress. But it seems that since COVID dented the business model, the people will now pick up the tab. Not that they weren't picking up the tab with the private sector involved anyway. Let's just see if we're learning the same lessons as we learned before. It could lead to significant savings. Sounds like chapter 1 of the excuses to me. Arbitration is referred to next in order to remain competitive as international arbitrators, and also, in my opinion, in a move towards less court and more arbitration. A bit like physicians' assistants for doctors rather than doctors or dentists. The bill around HS2 is not about reintroducing the northern leg, but reportedly about making sure the money actually is repurposed in connecting the northeast to the northwest. Not much mention that the geography is far from ideal, but I'm sure they've thought about that. More stringent audit measures for the largest companies. In my heart, I agree with it because they're so large and so powerful these days, and the externalities of their products are often not addressed. But the cynic in me says this is just great news for KPMG, PwC and the likes, and we'll all pay our bit towards that. GB Energy again sounds good, looking forward to a strategy to become energy independent. That ignores fracking, of course, and keeps energy prices down. Nope, I don't think it's doable. Beefing up the Crown estate, also allowing it to borrow, also feels it's about 10 years too late. But nonetheless, again, it sounds good. From the other side of the fence, the pushback will be more and bigger quangos. Sustainable aviation fuel also sounds interesting, but isn't something I've had a chance to look into in any detail, so I'm watching with interest. Water next, and this is the sort of thing I do like: private sector delivery, but with strong regulation on natural monopolies. Larger powers, more teeth and accountability. Much better than nationalisation. Border security. Renaming something that already exists. Promising big penalties for organised crime for criminals who are mostly outside of the UK, given where Interpol and international police cooperation has gone since Brexit. Fast-tracking asylum. Only one of these things will actually happen, and it'll be the last one, meaning the 100,000 still in the system will be processed faster at a likely success rate of between 70 and 90%, meaning that Serco, Mia's and the likes will be looking for how much more housing over the next couple of years. And listen carefully, because this is the first major opportunity of this new government. Leasing to providers is about to become even larger than it already has been becoming. It'll be a step change upwards. Not just HMO either, I would suspect. With LHA rates likely not to be frozen going forward, this could be a very sensible income stream to pick up if you're not already involved in it. The crime measures again sound great. I hope they all succeed, but they're out of scope here. How this tessellates with cutting the prison population, I guess there'll just have to be different methods of punishment. The schools bill aims to sweep up the wreckage of closing the schools during COVID. Primary school closure was always a terrible idea. Secondary and above was more of a balance. Even in the darling of the libertarian society that was Sweden, education was restricted or closed to over 16s, bear in mind. Skills England, a revamp of the apprentice system, which is not well spoken of. It should be a soft win. It's a big system to sort out. It could just be a case of a change is as good as a rest, but let's see. On to Renters Reform then, part 2, or Renters' Rights, as I say, it's now renamed. Judgment Day. I said a bill that went through under the Tory government would have been more favourable. However, it had been rushed through at the end. It would have had the same fate as the Leasehold Commonhold Reform bill anyway, and get redrafted and changed at the detail stage. One more legacy of the Sunak Independence Day election date. One sentence particularly worried me from the ideological position that tenants need more rights. Landlords disagree, of course. There are countries with fewer rights and more rights. This is where the UK typically sits. Anyone with any sense knows that if you make it unattractive for the providers, welcome to 2024 anyway, some might say, then you will damage an already damaged market. But as I said above, yields are continuing to improve, and the real market will just ask for a fair price for the risk, and the effort, and the hassle, and the abuse. It's probably deemed snobby or entitled in some quarters these days, in the lily-livered world we seem to live in, to even say this, but I'm going to say it anyway. In the King's Speech, bear in mind this is the magnum opus, this is the punch, and I've read most of it closely and skim-read the rest. This was the only obvious mistake I spotted. The bill will giving, which is spelt Giving, renters much greater security and stability, so they can stay in their homes for longer, build lives in their communities, and avoid the risk of homelessness. Yes, the bill will giving, drafted by an illiterate ideologue, but I'm sure everything will be fine. So the bill will, according to Labour and parliamentary consensus by definition, with this size of majority, number one, be abolishing Section 21 no-fault evictions, removing the threat of arbitrary evictions and increasing tenant security and stability. New, clear and expanded possession grounds will be introduced so landlords can reclaim their properties when they need to. The problem here, of course, is that they think Section 21s are arbitrary, when 99% of the time they're not arbitrary. This is a massive mistake in the way they're reading the data, and it's a lack of experience in the sector. Okay? Strengthening tenants' rights and protections. For example, we will empower tenants to challenge rent increases designed to force them out by the back door, and introduce new laws to end the practice of rental bidding wars by landlords and letting agents. This seems like it's solving a London problem mostly, in my opinion, and by the time the legislation goes through, the rental market will have cooled down from the white-hot market of the past 24 months, although it'll still be hot. How this practice will be stopped on a day-to-day basis in reality remains to be seen. Giving tenants the right to request a pet, which landlords must consider and cannot unreasonably refuse. Landlords will be able to request insurance to cover potential damage from pets if needed. Meanwhile, in the real world, good landlords have always allowed it and sometimes charged a premium, and bad tenants don't declare pets. This happen about as often as a tenant fulfills their AST requirement to get contents insurance. Applying a decent home standard to the private rented sector to ensure homes are safe, secure and hazard-free. Tackling the blight of poor quality homes. This sounds quite ideologically minded again. Social standards are far lower. The evidence is overwhelming. And in a week where the satisfaction ratings have been updated to over 80% in the PRS, enforcement of what's already in place would have been a much better move to actually change anything. But there we go. Applying Awab's law to the sector, setting clear legal expectations about the timeframes within which landlords in the private rental sector must make homes safe where they contain serious hazards. Yes, the law introduced on the back of the tragic death in social housing, applied first to the social housing sector. HHSRS is already pretty damn strong, folks. Again, I refer to the point above. You don't need to change this, you just need to enforce what you've already got. Creating a digital private rental sector to bring together key information for landlords, tenants and councils. Tenants will be able to access information to inform choices when entering new tenancies. Landlords will be able to quickly understand their obligations and demonstrate compliance, providing certainty for landlords and tenants alike. Councils will be able to use the database to target enforcement where it is needed most. Watered down from the PRS report I discussed a couple of months back, but the National Register is coming. But it won't let everybody know how many properties Jeremy Hunt owns. Or me. Although, if you know what you're doing, it's relatively easy to find out anyway. Welcome to Rent Smart Wales, which is anything but smart in my experience of it. Supporting quicker, cheaper resolution when there are disputes, preventing them escalating to costly court proceedings with a new ombudsman service for the private rented sector that will provide fair, impartial and binding resolution to both landlords and tenants and reducing the need to go to court. This makes sense. As a landlord, the number one problem you see by tenants posting online or in personal experience is the tenant's belief that they can, and indeed in their eyes should, withhold full rent. Shelter, CAB and the likes are all very clear on this. Don't do it. I refer to my arbitration comments above. As long as it's fair and there's a reminder the tenant has obligations which are longer and more arduous than the landlord's obligations, and I don't see there to be a way around this, the tenant has far more scope, far more utility in the property, and also has the right to quiet enjoyment. Making it illegal for landlords to discriminate against tenants in receipt of benefits or with children when choosing to let their property. So no family is discriminated against and denied a home when they need it. Feels a bit like a virtue signal, to be honest. I thought this already wasn't it, illegal? Maybe it's just the advertising that's illegal against benefits tenants. But let's face it, folks, the price does the discriminating, not the landlord, in my view, especially in the world we're in these days. Children are the same as pets. They're all about their owner, in reality. Wait and see how far the January 2024 rents are outside of people being able to secure a property in March 2025. And if this all goes badly and forces more people out of the sector, and the Section 21s are raining down at the moment, anecdotally, it will all come out in the headlines over the coming months. Let us know when that's going to change. Institutions building large-scale homes for those on benefits. Good luck with that plan. Strengthening local councils' enforcement powers. New investigatory powers will make it easier for councils to identify and fine unscrupulous landlords and drive bad actors out of the sector. Bit worrying, to be honest. They're already too strong, with fines up to 30k on multiple counts. They are largely being used against the worst actors at the moment, but I see plenty of examples of abuse of power. When the worst is dealt with, it's on to the next weakest link. Then when is the weakest link you? Or me? Now, the stats they're working from here. 11 million private tenants, 1.4 million households with dependent children, 444,000 households with over 65s privately renting. No-fault evictions resulted in a record 25,910 households being threatened with homelessness in 2023. But there is fault in a huge majority of these cases, you idiots. Wait till the figures next year. 2,682 households in England were removed from their homes by bailiffs because of no-fault evictions between January and March. So look at the choice of words, because of no-fault evictions. That wasn't the reason, though, was it? People don't call bailiffs when there's no fault. Up 19% in a year, and the highest number in 6 years. So just over 10% of the cases go to bailiffs. This is the Section 21s that actually were officially measured and issued, so they must have been shown to a local authority, because there's no nationwide register of Section 21 notices. You wouldn't know how many were served, and then the tenant saw it and said, right, fair enough, I'll move on. No problem. So the last 2 years has, which is another mistake, seen unprecedented levels of growth in rental prices. Whilst the annual growth rate in rents has been around 2% usually, in March 2024, yearly increase in the average stock of tenancies reached 9%. Yes, inflation even applies to rent. Who knew? In 2021, private rented sector tenants spent 38% of their income on rent, excluding housing support, whereas homeowners only spent 21% on mortgage costs and social renters 27% on rent. I can't imagine a worse year for comparison than 2021 with mortgage owners, when mortgage interest rates were below 1% for homeowners taking mortgages that year. Why are we excluding housing support when so many people get it? 21% of private rented sector homes, approximately 1 million properties, are non-decent, and 12%, approximately 580,000, contain a Category 1 hazard such as severe damp or mould. So they say. And will there be any emphasis on lifestyle causing any damp or mould? There's your problem. Anyway, enough of that bill. Let's see what happens. I'm skipping the football regulator, since it stubbornly refused to come home once more last week, and getting straight onto Leasehold Commonhold Reform, and the last major chunk for this week. Here are the bullets. Enacting remaining Law Commission recommendations to bolster leaseholders' fundamental rights to extend their lease and buy their freehold, enfranchisement, and take over the freeholders' business management functions, right to manage. Well, that seems reasonable. Reinvigorating Commonhold by modernising the legal framework. We will also restrict the sale of new leasehold flats. The government will consult on the best way to achieve this, so that generations to come will benefit from absolute home ownership. This makes sense in London or high-value areas. In less expensive areas, small blocks will be completely unworkable. What do I mean by small? Probably less than 12 or maybe even up to 20 units. Not sure this helps to meet targets. Convert to rent will be the only way, although in lower value areas, arguably, it probably already is. Tackling existing ground rents by regulating ground rents for existing leaseholders so they no longer face unregulated and unaffordable costs. I look forward to the £30 billion black hole conversation again then that we've already had for months and months on end. Bringing the injustice of fleecehold private estates and unfair costs to an end. The government will consult on the best way to achieve this and implement new protections for homeowners on private estates in the Leasehold and Freehold Reform Act 2024. This is code for, we don't know how this bit will work, and it probably won't. ending the injustice of forfeiture so that leaseholders are protected against losing savings they have in their home for potentially small unpaid debts. I can't imagine there's too much of it, but it absolutely should be stopped in most cases, I don't doubt. The data as the government sees it. There are 5 million leasehold dwellings in England and Wales. England has 1.3 million leasehold houses, although fewer than 500 are now built per year. The remaining 3.4 million existing leasehold homes in England are flats. Today there are fewer than 20 Commonhold blocks in England and Wales. Commonhold was introduced in 2002. 86% of leaseholders pay a ground rent, averaging almost £300 a year in England. In a recent survey undertaken by Propenomix, a leading membership body for property agents, 78% of their members reported that a leasehold property with an escalating ground rent will struggle to sell, even if it's been priced correctly. My argument would be that it simply hasn't been priced correctly then, because these are so damaging to a flat's value. This would be the second and less significant opportunity here. There is a cast iron guarantee that things will improve for leaseholders. This has significantly increased the value of flats with escalating ground rents and other issues. Ground rents that are far too high, well above 0.2% of the property's value, for example. Until these are enshrined in law, the acceptable market price for these is unlikely to change. Do not take this as a trigger to go mad on leasehold. Always assess the freeholder. Are they difficult, or do they practice illegal practices? If they do that, they're likely to continue to do so. However, there is an arbitrage opportunity here that comes up quite rarely. Leasehold is going to get somewhere between a little and a lot better for leaseholders, and I like to make one-way bets which are win only. Buy at a sensible price and expect a dividend in the right circumstances. That's what I'm going to be doing. There's little more to say on the remaining bills. Lords Reform, hereditary peers, yeah, get rid of them. The world's moved on, it's outdated and inherently unequal. Other ideas, such as getting rid of 80-year-olds arbitrarily, I stand vehemently against. It's stupid, discriminatory and ageist. Judge people by their contribution, not their age. Warren Buffett wouldn't be able to sit in the Lords. Branson would have just over 5 years left, if he were in the Lords, but he isn't. Lord Sugar is 77. Does he strike you as Biden, as it might now be known? Getting rid of this level of experience would be stupid, and I hope they have a change of heart about that bit. It hasn't been mentioned in the King's speech, but it has been mentioned by Labour, to be clear. There were 142 over 80 and another 12 over 90 at the last count. The irony of a cybersecurity bill on Wednesday being announced in the King's speech and then the events of Friday playing out were not lost on anyone, I'm sure. My commiserations if you were travelling, or trying to send a large amount of money, or seeing a doctor. Gulp. I could hear the whoops as pen and paper was needed to do stuff. Good job low tech still has a place, eh? The final bill sought, I'm sure, to kick some more sand in the eyes of those who deposed a few Labour favourites, and normally took a few more scalps, with the new government side leaving no doubt about a continued pro-Israel stance. The last bit of data they cite, the Metropolitan Police recorded an over 1,000% rise in anti-Semitic incidents following Hamas's attack on Israel last year, compared to the previous year. Whether the independent candidates, or the Workers' Party, or the next iteration will be quite so vocal in 5 years' time is unclear, but to write this off as a storm in a teacup will be a mistake in my view, and there are future ructions coming. It really will be very interesting to see how robustly, or not, this iteration of the Labour Party handles it. Interestingly, the 5 bills that fall under Rayner's direct remit are of course the 3 discussed at length above, in terms of planning, in terms of leasehold reform, in terms of renters' rights, also the English Devolution Bill, and also the Holocaust Memorial Bill, referred to at the end just there. Rayner has said before that Labour will recognise Palestine, but there's nothing to recognise now. More context is needed than that, of course, but I can't imagine what her DMs look like, to be honest. I wish her all the very best, and she will need every inch of that toughness that her upbringing has instilled so firmly within her. There was actually an interesting speech this week in the Commons from Kemi Badenoch to Angela Rayner about how Rayner has been quite so badly stitched up, apart from anything else, because the money won't be there to achieve the plans that she wants to achieve, when it comes to housing targets anyway. There's an absolute ton to chew on this week, but as usual, nothing to really worry about in my view. Plenty to react to, consider and inform. Stick with it. This whole situation gets worse for the tenant before it gets better, but when the new system doesn't work, perhaps the direction of hostility and travel in general will change. To the survivors will go the spoils. The victors will simply be the ones that remain in the game. Well done as always for getting to the end. Once again, more than I intended, but in these modern day historically political times, with so much irrelevance, I wanted to get right into the details. Thank you for your attention, and I hope it was of use. There's only one way to deal with this continual noise and all the unfolding chapters. Keep calm, always listen to the supplement, and carry on. Thank you.